As Palestinians observe the 75th anniversary of their mass displacement known as the Nakba, a fragile ceasefire holds with the Israelis. What can be done to make a lasting peace in the Middle East? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. To Israelis, the creation of their state in 1948 was a moment of celebration, but for thousands of Palestinians, it became known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands were displaced and had to flee to neighboring countries. For the first time, the Nakba is being celebrated at the United Nations, despite criticism from Israel. 30 countries decided not to participate in the events. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas called for the suspension of Israel's membership in the UN for repeatedly violating resolutions. Meanwhile, a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad appears to be holding. Akram al-Satari has more from Gaza.
The intensified Egyptian mediation efforts resulted in a shaky ceasefire in Gaza on Saturday that ended 5 days of widespread bombardment and heavy devastation. During the escalation, at least 35 people, almost all of them Palestinians, were killed. Despite minor infringement reported during the early hours of the ceasefire, the truce is still holding now into its third day. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the mass displacement of Palestinians, known as the Nakba or the catastrophe. And for the first time this year, the United Nations commemorated the anniversary in the UN headquarters in New York on Monday, though several countries, including the United States, boycotted the event. This most recent escalation of violence here in Gaza, at least the 11th spike since 2006, came just 9 months after the previous days-long battle between Israel and militias in the coastal enclave. Akram al-Satari, CGTN, Gaza.
Well, we have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelist. Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. From London, Abdel Atwan is editor-in-chief of al-Youm. Sara Hirschhorn is an historian and political analyst. She's joining us from Jerusalem. Also from Jerusalem, Gil Hoffman is a journalist and executive director of the media watchdog Honest Reporting. Welcome to the broadcast. Khalil, Palestinians observing the Nakba, or the catastrophe as it's called, to mark the independence of Israel, also the displacement of thousands of Palestinians. For our international audience that may not be familiar with it, how would you describe this and the importance of this Nakba?
Well, it's an important event for the Palestinians since essentially 1948 with the creation of Israel and the dismantlement of Palestinian society. As a result, Palestinians have commemorated that day to remind themselves of where they came from, what their homeland is, and where they would like to essentially express their national aspirations in the future. And it's been generation after generation celebrating this day. As your reporter mentioned in the backgrounder, the UN for the first time since the beginning of the conflict has commemorated that day at the United Nations. Many countries do respect that, others do not. Of course, in Israel, that day, generally speaking, is denied. There's only a small minority, probably, of Israelis that do honor that day and do consider the need emotionally, if there is ever to be peace between Israelis and Palestinians, that Israeli society and Israeli government need to acknowledge that consequence or the fallout from the creation of the State of Israel, the dismantlement of Palestinian society, namely the Nakba.
And Sarah, I want to, as a historian, I want to get your thoughts on the events leading to Israel's independence and this celebration of Nakba.
Yes, well, I mean, we certainly today embrace a dual narrative approach to discuss what happened in 1948, a war that Israel celebrates as its war of independence, and a same war which Palestinians commemorate as their Nakba, their national tragedy. So we certainly have two divergent paths where in 1947, the United Nations had passed a resolution that allowed for the state of Israel to come into being as a state, but certainly a state of Israel emerged, and a state of Palestine did not. And since 1948, we've been essentially relitigating the consequences of the 1948 war and its aftermath. That today we do not have a state of Israel and a state of Palestine living side by side in peace and security. Rather, we have a state of Israel that's been in existence now for its 75th year, and a state of Palestine that is still waiting with its own national aspirations to also merit statehood.
Abdel, let me ask you about the UN commemorating this event and the fact that 30 countries, including the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, voted against the resolution to adopt this year's commemoration. How important is it that the UN recognized it? And talk to us about these other 30 countries objecting to it.
I'm glad you are saying commemoration, not celebration, because it is really a commemoration day for millions of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians all over the world. It is really a good step from United Nations to actually commemorate the Nakba Day and recognize the suffering of the Palestinian people. I was extremely surprised why US actually did not attend this commemoration. Even why Ukraine, which is actually saying that we are under the Russian invasion and our country is going to be destroyed, why they are not actually attending these events actually, and to support and show solidarity with the Palestinian people who were actually invaded. The country was invaded, and it was actually, they were expelled. About 760,000 people, including my family, were expelled from the territories. So, okay, it is a good step, but there are 1,000 resolutions passed by United Nations, according to, or actually to ask the Israeli to leave the Palestinian territories, but none of those 1,000 resolutions were not implemented at all. So, okay, it is a good step, but we need actually action. We need the United Nations to give us a state, the way they did give the Israeli a state on our accounts. So it's, as I said, it is really unfair. The American government should be ashamed of itself when they actually stay away from this human disaster, which is worse than Hiroshima and on all means. You know, Hiroshima, okay, people were killed in one go, and Hiroshima, Japan were not divided. Japanese people were not dismissed or expelled from their countries. But when it comes to us as a Palestinian, you know, thousands of people were killed, and that still the death process is continuing, and we are not actually in our country. I am a refugee. I was actually the victim of these Israeli atrocities, this Israeli Nakba, and that's what there are at least 10 million Palestinians like me.
Gil, it looked like you wanted to jump in. I want to get your thoughts.
Absolutely. The United Nations should be marking a Nakba, and the Nakba is the catastrophe of 850,000 Jews who were expelled from Arab and Muslim countries with the creation of the State of Israel, with nothing but the shirt on their back, wealthy people who gave up everything. The United Nations should not be singling out the one Jewish state, the creation of the one Jewish state, as a catastrophe. That's anti-Semitism when you single out the one Jewish state. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism that's been embraced by the entire world, they hosted the Palestinian leader Abbas, who mocked the Holocaust in his horrible speech that he had there. And now you're hearing someone belittle Japanese people losing their lives. You know, the Palestinian people have suffered, but their numbers have grown. And that's not something to be singled out. What they should be singling out is 76 years of Palestinian rejectionism of the two-state solution that they were offered by that United Nations in 1947.
Okay, Abdul, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, I'm surprised I didn't actually saying bad things about the Japanese. I said Japan, it was a disaster. That you know, thousands of, hundreds of thousands of Japanese were killed, but you know, the death process that this against the Palestinians are continue. And I highly respect the Japanese people. What I'm saying about the American who actually bombed them, used a nuclear bomb against them. So the Israeli actually benefited from this American position, supporting the Israeli to take place to expel us from our territories. This is the problem. And at the top of that, when the Israeli killed more than 30 civilians on the Gaza Strip, just few days ago, the American considered this a self-defense. And if we do it, for example, in defending our rights, calling for the United Nations to side by us, we are considered a terrorist. This is unfair. I believe the Americans who are talking about democracy, human rights, glorifying the human rights, respect the international community, international law, they are not attending this commemoration. This gives us a huge clarification of this unfair American against the Palestinian people, the support of the Israeli who are actually committing atrocities and who are depriving the Palestinian from the right of return to go and establish their own state like the Israeli. This is the suffering of the Palestinian. This is actually the angry among the Palestinian and also among the Arab world. And today, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, the only democracy in the Middle East, was saying we are going ahead with the assassination policies. We will kill anybody, any Palestinian who actually dares to actually reject any storming of the Jerusalem or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the problem we are facing. A prime minister of the only democratic country in the Middle East, glorifying the assassination of innocent people in Gaza. 30 people were killed by the Israeli, and they said we will continue. We are not going to stop. This is our policy, and we will kill anybody who actually say no to our policies in the occupied territories.
Sara, how would you describe the tensions that exist right now between the Israeli government and the Palestinians? I mean, just a few months ago, an Israeli minister called for a Palestinian village to be erased. How would you describe the relationship right now?
Well, I think things are not necessarily at an all-time high, but certainly they're very, very tense this week, especially with the holiday later this week known as Jerusalem Day, which has been a moment that has touched off large-scale violence in years past. Certainly the new Israeli coalition, which is the most religious and right-wing in Israeli history, has its own agenda that has been being advocated now by activists who used to be on the fringe of Israeli politics but are now in the heart of the Knesset, which is a major change. But I disagree with our former commentator that Israel has no right to protect itself from terror. These are policies that continue under this current Netanyahu administration, as they have in the past, basically under the leadership of any prime minister in the state of Israel. And I don't think that this particular conflict over targeted assassinations would be any different under any other prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu or otherwise.
Khalil, let me ask you about right now. We're in the middle of a ceasefire. We saw 5 days of violence, rockets being lobbed both directions. It seems as though it's only a matter of time, though, before we see a resumption of violence. For those of us who've been watching this for years, would you agree with that? And what needs to happen?
I do agree with that. Being one of those you just referred to as who've been observing this conflict for many, many years, too many years, as a matter of fact, being such a protracted conflict, escaping a political resolution for so long. It's very frustrating because, frankly, what we have seen the past 5 days is deja vu. I mean, we've seen this movie before. Every few months, we have to have a military clash. This one was slightly different than in the past. Usually in the past, it's related to some military aspect or reason, unlike this one, which has been essentially purely political. I mean, the rationale for the attack on Gaza had something to do with a tit for tat or a clash over political things. It was the threat to the existence of the current coalition. To me, when a state engages in violence, particularly against civilian targets, for political reasons, that's the classic definition of terrorism, state-administered terror. according to the American legal definition of terrorism. So we have seen this conflict before. Eventually, we either move to a political solution to the Palestine problem. We deal with the Nakba straightforward. We deal with the fallout from the Nakba straightforward, be it the dispersion of the Palestinians, the refugees, the right of return, the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories, the rights of Palestinians inside Israel. Unless we deal with this, unless there is a political horizon awaiting some serious and fair and just negotiations, we're simply going to see one process after the other. And you know, it's been sad. It's been 75 years that haven't served the peace aspiration of neither Palestinian children nor Israeli children. We're still stuck in the same predicament unless there is a political horizon. And I agree with Abdel. Unfortunately, the U.S. bias in this respect has not helped. On the one hand, you have the United States of America claiming sole sponsorship of peace in the Middle East that nobody else can even allowed by the U.S. To mediate or takes its role, not even the United Nations. Yet at the same time, the U.S. is afraid to engage in any serious and just negotiations and to sponsor such activities, diplomatic activities. Instead, it's one administration, one biased administration after the other, adding to the problem. So the U.S. Clearly, as it was described, is no longer just a neutral party to the conflict. It is a legitimate, involved party in this conflict. It's part and parcel of the conflict, and it has contributed to it instead of resolving it.
Gil, you just heard Khalil. He says we've seen this movie before. We're still stuck. I want to get your thoughts.
I actually agree with him that there should be a peace process, and the Palestinians shouldn't keep on rejecting a two-state solution. There's been a lot of criticism here of the United States, where you've had Democratic and Republican presidents do everything possible to ensure that there would be a peace process, of Israeli politicians where right-wing, left-wing, centrist leaders have all expressed support for a two-state solution, have all negotiated, while the Palestinian leadership has never missed an opportunity. To miss an opportunity, Abbas has had so many chances. He was offered 100% of the West Bank with land swaps by Prime Minister Olmert. He missed a sweetheart deal with Ehud Barak. They were defending terrorism. They were defending the 1,400 rockets fired at Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Israelis. Now, those 1,400 rockets pathetically only killed one 80-year-old woman who got killed by a rocket.
Okay, Khalil, let Gil finish, and then we'll get to you.
Well, he's not arguing.
Hold on for just a second, Khalil. Let him finish, and I'm going to give you a chance to respond. Go ahead, Gil.
An 8-year-old woman who's helping her husband get into a bomb shelter was the only person killed, but every single one of those 1,400 rockets was intended to murder Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Israelis. Now, the IDF, the Israeli army, did everything possible to minimize civilian deaths. They did pinpointed operations to hit terrorists. Yes, Islamic Jihad is a terrorist organization recognized by the United States, by the European Union, and the entire world as a terrorist organization. They were trying to murder as many civilians as possible in Islamic Jihad. Israel was trying to minimize civilian deaths. If Israel wanted to harm Palestinians, they could have killed thousands of people. They killed, by their numbers, 30. By other numbers, only 10 civilians while they were targeting these terrorists.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Yes.
Hamas chose to stay out of this war and the previous war because they are governing the Palestinians in Gaza, and they realize that the Palestinian people deserve better, that terrorism is not going to get them a state anytime soon. And neither will shows like this that single out the creation of the Jewish state as if it's some kind of catastrophe. With these kinds of Palestinian speakers, I pity the Palestinians, and they're not going to get a state anytime soon.
All right, Khalil, your response.
Exactly the opposite of what he's just with speakers like Gil defending the Israelis. I think I pity the Israelis. I don't think Israel is going to see peace, not in this generation nor in probably future generations either. His talking points are essentially the problem. I think Sarah was right when she referred to two narratives. Clearly, we have given an example of the two narratives, but one narrative is clearly based on total denial. You know, the Palestinians are not legitimate. Any act to resist occupation is considered terror, according to Gil and the people who gave him the talking points. that he supports. And that is not going to lead to any political solution at all. The problem with this concept of radical Zionism that is based on denial, not only physical denial, but political denial, cultural denial, and the inability to cope with the fact that the other side is an equal claimant to the same piece of real estate. So let's sit down and talk about it. Is there potentially a political solution to this problem? If not, then what we have witnessed the past 5 days and what we have witnessed the past 75 years is going to be the pattern.
Sarah, is there a political solution there? And you know, as a historian, you know, the old saying, history has a way of repeating itself. I think if we had re-racked a program like this from 10 years ago, we'd hear probably the same talking points back and forth. I mean, how do we get people off their positions and into a room where they're negotiating?
I think the American aphorism, where there's a will, there's a way, is really the question right now. I don't see that there is sufficient leadership on either the Israeli or Palestinian side, certainly Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition, but also Mahmoud Abbas, who is now, 17 years into a 4-year term, who I think has very little legitimacy amongst younger Palestinians, and the disunity between Hamas and in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank make it very difficult to even restart negotiations on the principles that were set forward by the Oslo Accords. Now, we might also argue that many of the parameters of the Oslo Accords seem quite outdated to us now, since there have been sufficient, changes on the ground to perhaps require substantial adjustment to what was laid out in the decade of the 1990s. But again, I think that the basic parameters are still possible, but without leadership that will inspire particularly a new generation of young Israelis and Palestinians, who I think have been radicalized by the last 20 years of this cycle of violence, I don't see being able to reach any kind of political solution in the years coming down the road.
Abdel, I want to get your thoughts on this. Hamas taking control of the Gaza Strip. You got the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank. How has that complicated this matter in terms of trying to come up with some kind of political solution?
Well, I believe, yes, Hamas didn't take a side in this war, which the Israeli actually initiated when they sent their warplanes, when they sent their drones in order to bomb the Palestinians in Gaza, who cannot defend themselves properly against these planes. But what I want to comment, actually, your Israeli speaker said clearly that the Palestinians actually derailed the two-state solution, and they did not accept it, and we are talking about negotiation. I would like to remind you that the Israeli who killed the two-state solution completely, the Palestinians were talking to the Israeli, negotiating with the Israeli to implement the Oslo Agreement for the last 30 years. How many years are they going to talk to the Israeli in order to implement UN or Oslo Agreement or UN resolution? This is the problem, is they're always blaming the Palestinians. They occupy the land, they kill the people, they raise down all the villages, and they ask people actually, and they uprooted our olives trees, and then they say the Palestinians are responsible. We are the people under occupation, the Israeli occupation. We are the people who were expelled by force by the Israelis. We are the people who are under the Israeli attacks every day, every month. This is the problem we are facing. So they blaming us. You blame the victims. This is the disaster here. Always blaming the Palestinians. Who is occupying West Bank? Who is occupying Gaza Strip? Who is imposing sanctions against starving the people in Gaza? Who are bombing the Palestinians everywhere, depriving us from the right of return like everybody else. The Jews, they can't go to Israel anytime and become a citizen. And I cannot go back to my territory simply because I am a refugee. I am not accepted. And the same thing, Mr. Jahshan, he is also a refugee. So we have to talk about the realities on the ground, about the Israeli attacks against us, about the Israeli war. Today, okay, maybe they praised Hamas because it did not participate and defend the Palestinian people under its rules. But tomorrow, it will be a terrorist organization simply because Hamas is defending the people against the Israeli atrocities on the Gaza Strip. So I believe the Israelis should implement more than 1,000 resolutions passed by United Nations. Israel actually never committed to this. And when Abbas, who is actually gave everything to the Israeli, established security forces of 70,000 to protect the settlers, Jewish settlers on the, which is an unofficial, legitimized settlement. He defending the Israeli. He actually protecting them. And now they say he is not good for negotiation. For how many years shall we negotiate? For 100 years, for example, 200 years in order, to see what the Israeli, whether they will accept the international community or not.
All right. Let me give Gil a chance to respond.
I'm surrounded by refugees. All around me, there are people here who moved here from Iraq, from Morocco, from Afghanistan, from all over the Middle East, from Iran. And you know what they did? They became, little by little, settled and built themselves up into the leaders of this country. While the Arab states
were not
have
kicked out by force. You've been recruiting them for decades.
Citizens in 22 Arab states, 57 Muslim states, they haven't helped them at all. Israel does more to help the Palestinians in the West Bank than any other country in the world. And while perpetual victimhood ends up not helping the Palestinians at all, look at what's happened over here. In the same period of time, around the same amount of people, 850,000 Jews, you talk about 750,000 Arabs, they have risen. And I hope that the Palestinian people will have a better life too.
Khalil?
Let's hope.
It's kind of hard to respond to these allegations, in the sense, again, I repeat what I said before. You essentially have a Zionist concept here that doesn't see the reality of the Palestinians. Even some of the most ardent supporters of the State of Israel recently came back from a visit to Israel, a former ambassador of Jewish background, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel. He came back and he essentially said, in Israel of today, the Palestinians are ghosts. They do not even appear on the radar screen. There is no alternative in Israel to recognize Palestinian rights and, as I said earlier, to recognize the Palestinian as someone who is a counter-claimant, an equal cultural and political entity that has the right to live on that same piece of real estate and to see whether that can be negotiated and accommodated. As long as this denial, keeps saying you're from Iraq, I'm not from Iraq. You refer to the Jewish immigrants. Your agencies, your Zionist agencies, spent more than 5 decades recruiting people from Iraq, subverting the lives of the Iraqi Jewish community, the Moroccan Jewish community, and the Yemeni Jewish community to get them, to force them to immigrate to Israel and be a fodder in this conflict. And so don't talk to me about we are equal. We brought in 800, you took 750, so the conflict is over. That doesn't make sense. It hasn't worked for 75 years. And if you are to live for another 75, it's not going to work either.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to thank all our panelists for joining us. A robust discussion, to say the least. Thanks very much. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.